Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us today. My name is Katie Smoller. I'm the Director of Educational Programs here at the National History Academy, and we'd like to thank you for tuning in again as we continue our Hispanic Heritage Month program. And today we are fortunate enough to be joined by the Tenement Museum in New York City, and we are with the museum educator, Danielle Whitmore, and the collections manager, Lana Dubbin. So thank you both so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Katie. We are excited to be joining you from the Tenement Museum. And before we begin our program, I want to let everyone know that this is an active program. So Danielle is going to be asking some questions throughout the program, and we would love if you could put your answers or your own questions in the chat on Facebook. Katie will then send any of those questions on to me, and I will make sure that Danielle reads them. They might be not in the order you ask because I'm going to make sure that they fit within the timeline of the program. So without further ado, let's meet the Saez-Valez family, and I'm going to turn it over to Danielle.
Thank you so much, Lana. And yeah, we really do want your questions. So anytime throughout the program, if you think, oh, I want to know more about that, or I have a question about that thing, just pass it along, put that in the chat, and Lana will be sure to get it to me. So without any further ado, welcome to the Tenement Museum. It's a virtual experience. We are looking at the Saez-Valez family. And the picture here is of Ramanita Saez, and she is sitting on the roof of one of our tenement buildings. So we at the Tenement Museum have two buildings in Manhattan, in the island of Manhattan on the Lower East Side. And today we're going to really be thinking about the 1960s and a family that lived in a building on the Lower East Side named the Saez-Valez family. And this is the mother of that family, Ramanita. And they made a home eventually in this building here. And this building was built in the 1880s, and families lived in it all the way up until just a few years ago. In fact, Ramanita lived in this building until the year 2011. But again, we're really thinking about the 1960s today. And this family, they eventually made a home inside of an apartment here. That apartment has a bathroom, a closet, a dining room, one bedroom, kitchen, living room, second bedroom. So it's a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. And they move into this building in 1963. But before they move into this building with a kitchen that looks like this, they're from Puerto Rico. We see this Puerto Rican flag in their kitchen. And so this is a close-up of that Puerto Rican flag, this souvenir pin that is showing their ties to this place. It's a way of holding on to this relationship. And this is a map of the island of Puerto Rico. And Puerto Rico has a 400-year period of control under colonization. And the island of Puerto Rico goes from being a Spanish colony to a territory of the United States in 1890. And so people who live on the island of Puerto Rico become US citizens when a certain law is passed called the Jones Act in the early 1900s. But even before this land was colonized, there were people living on this land. There's the indigenous population, the Taino people who were living there before the Spanish colonized it, and then the United States takes control over the island as well. And this family, right, they are living here up until the year 1955. And 1955 is when they move from Puerto Rico to New York. And they're from a town called Saez-Valez. And this is what Saez-Valez looked like. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what it was like to live here, given what you see here. What do you think it was like to live here? So I'll start to describe what I see here, and then you can start to tell us what you think it would be like to live here. So in the middle of this image, it's a black and white image. I see a street and sidewalks on either side. And then on the other side of those sidewalks are buildings. These buildings look like they're made out of a variety of different materials. Maybe some metal, maybe some plaster, maybe some wood. And they're of different heights. I see some that are 1 story high, some that are 2. Some of them have outdoor balconies. Not all of them do. There are power lines. We have these poles with electricity and telephone wires. And there's a car on this street. There are also lots of people. I see many children in this image. More children than adults, I think. Yeah. And then in the background of the image, I see a mountain and a lot of like nature, a lot of trees.
So Danielle, we're getting some responses. We have a visitor who says that their abuela is from Saez-Valez, so they are
a family
familiar.
Connection.
Wonderful connection. Some impressions are that it looks nice, it looks clean, people look happy, and I'm curious what makes you think that, but I also see the children, so maybe that's what they're thinking about, people looking happy.
It looks like some of them are talking to each other or maybe playing with each other. It looks like there's people around, so we might have sounds and stuff, but it doesn't seem super crowded. There's not lots and lots of people in this picture right here. And thinking about, access to electricity and telephone technology and the homes that they have here. And so Ramanita lived here with her 2 sons, Andy and Jose. And Ramanita, the mother of this family, she sewed gloves. That was the job she had. She worked in a garment shop, a garment factory, sewing gloves. But that work was not sustainable. By itself, it just wasn't enough work in Puerto Rico. This is a time period where the United States is investing a lot of money in the island of Puerto Rico in creating jobs and industry there. But a lot of those jobs were for people, required the laborers, the people who would work there, the workers, to have advanced degrees, like college educations, and speak English. Much of the island, the population of the island of Puerto Rico speaks Spanish and didn't necessarily have advanced degrees. Ramanita didn't. And so she's looking elsewhere. She's looking to move. And so she decides with her boys to leave Saez-Valez. The boys are in elementary school and they move to New York. They're not alone in this journey. There are other people who also get on a plane and go from Puerto Rico to New York looking for jobs in the garment industry. This picture is not of Ramanita, but it's of another woman from Puerto Rico. It's of many women from Puerto Rico getting on an airplane to go to the United States. And now I'm going to play some videos of some scholars talking about this process. I'll talk about it too. I'll sort of break down what they're saying, but also any questions you have about anything that they're sharing, pass that along too. Sorry.
At the time that Ramonita came from Puerto Rico, it was a time when the island was going through the process of industrialization.
Throughout the turn of the century, its economy was mostly agriculture, coffee production, tobacco, and large sugarcane plantations with lots of workers. It had a very high level of poverty and inequality on the island, and it suffered greatly from the Depression. As Puerto Rico was emerging from the Great Depression, the plan was to industrialize the island, to bring foreign investment, mostly U.S. investment, and to spur factories throughout the island.
Oil refineries grew from simple little stills into multi-million-dollar factories.
But those really weren't enough to absorb all the workforce.
A population that was not skilled enough, didn't know the English language well enough, did not have the education enough to be able to be employed in these new industries. And so their next best bet was to migrate.
So there's a lot going on in what they were talking about, and some of the things I'd already started to talk about. So they're saying, Puerto Rico is going through the process of industrialization, so that their economy, the economy of Puerto Rico, is going from more agricultural, so like farming and that kind of production, to more factory-based production. And that's spurring change in the economy. And also there was this investment that was coming. But again, those workers who were being hired weren't really the people who lived on the island of Puerto Rico. They were people coming from elsewhere to move to Puerto Rico to do those jobs. So those jobs weren't necessarily going to the people already living here. Again, if there's questions coming up with that, I'm very happy to go back to it. Lana?
Yeah, so just a few people have asked, why did they move? So I think we're wondering specifically why Ramanita and her sons would move to the United States.
Yeah, for greater economic opportunity, for the chance at making more money. So, right, she had the skill of sewing, but that wasn't enough, right? That is an industrialized job, but there wasn't enough sustainable work for that in Puerto Rico. But New York City was the heart of the garment industry in the United States at this time. And the garment factories were looking for workers. And so Ramanita had this skill. The skill didn't pay well or enough or regularly enough in Puerto Rico, but it would pay regularly enough in New York. So they moved to New York for her to take that job, to work in the garment industry. And she gets a job working in the garment industry. Sewing. She's working at a sewing machine. This isn't a picture of Ramanita, but another woman who's working in a garment factory. Working at a sewing machine means you're working long hours. You're working maybe 10 hours a day. And the work was oftentimes dangerous too. We have one woman who we spoke to, and she said, you know, we can see how close their fingers are here to the sewing machine, to the needle. And they said they called it graduation, the first time you got a needle through your finger. But this work was work she was able to do as soon as she got here. There were many other Puerto Rican women who worked in this industry, so she was able to get a job while speaking Spanish. And she met a lot of people. Right away, she's able to join the union, the ILGWU, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And here we have a collection of artifacts from her. This is her honorary lifetime membership card. She paid union dues for over 25 years. And we see her name and her signature on some of these too. And so by joining the ILGWU, she got benefits, health insurance, a death benefit fund, and the unions would fight for better wages, for more safe work environments. But they also had outings. There was fun involved. They would go on picnics. They would go on trips. And so Ramanita and her 2 elementary school aged sons, when they first arrive here, they don't really know that many people. But right away, they're invited on these outings through the union. And so they can be part of a community pretty quickly, and it helps them feel more at home. This is a picture of a parade that the union marched in, and it says International Ladies Garment Workers Union. And it says, you know, we are going to march as Puerto Ricans. And so there was a lot of the membership of this union, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, that was Puerto Rican. Ramanita, when we asked her about it and asked if she experienced any discrimination or racism, she said, no, I felt really comfortable and at home in the union. But that's not what everybody said. Some people said, yeah, we have a lot of Puerto Rican women who are working here, but when we look at the leadership of the union, we look at people above us, it's mostly white people who are still making these choices and holding these positions of power. And so in some cases, these Puerto Rican women were coming together to try to push back, to say, we have a voice too, and our voice matters and should be part of this. And so that also shows us that different people have different memories or perspectives or experiences in one movement at any time. Anything else coming up, Lana?
Yes, we're getting a lot of questions. So the questions are about the garment industry. And so I'm going to ask all of the questions because they're all about the union and the garment industry. But they're wondering, was it a female-only profession, or did men work in the garment industry? And then how did they work in the garment industry? Also, was it common for people to be in union memberships and have union membership at this time? And was there a minimum wage? So that question is kind of getting at, what did union membership benefits give you as a worker and an employee?
Yeah, there was a minimum wage, but it's a little bit different than we think of today. Because when you worked in the garment industry, and also still today, but we don't have we have very few unionized garment industries, garment factories in New York now, but they got paid by the piece. And so there was a certain price set by the piece. So every shirt you made, you got X amount of dollars or cents for. And the union worked with factory bosses to set those prices, to negotiate on your behalf, to make sure that you were getting as much as possible. And sometimes those negotiations were about the price, but sometimes the negotiations were also about the type of garment. Some garments you could sew faster than others, so maybe that had a little bit of a lower per piece rate, but because you were able to do it so fast, sometimes the workers preferred that. The garment factories didn't only employ women, but women made up sort of the vast majority of garment workers, particularly people working at the sewing machines. Men working in factories often were involved in ironing or pressing. So there's these like really big machines that have these like big levers on, and you push them down and you hear the steam like go, and it's really hot and really heavy, and that's going to press the garments. Men were often involved in that work, but you don't need as many of them as you need sewing machine operators. And so I think that gender dynamic is also broken down in the naming of this union. But I don't remember, we just had a talk where we were told, how the ILGW changed over time and sort of what they are now. And I can't remember the name of them, but it's not as specifically gendered anymore. Did I miss one?
No, those were all the questions. Well, was union membership common?
Super common. Mm-hmm. Yeah, if you worked in a garment factory at this time in the 1960s, yes, it was likely you were part of a union.
Great. And then, so the questions now are kind of about the apartment itself and how the museum recreated the apartment. So we have a question, I think it was about Ramanita's portrait, but the question was, is this a real portrait or is this recreated? And is the apartment what's real and what's recreated? And we also have a comment that someone really thinks this apartment is very beautiful, and they thought that the tenements, they had this impression of them being run down and horrible, but this apartment gives a very different impression.
Oh, I'm so glad that you think it's beautiful and that you're thinking so critically about what that means about tenements. I think I'm going to start with talking about tenements and then moving into what we know about the space and why it looks like this. So tenement is a word that isn't really in fashion anymore. It's not a word we use very often anymore. But it's a word that really became very popular in the middle of the 1800s. It was really at the height of when it was coming into usage and lasted for a while. And so when it came into usage, there's laws that are attached to it. And the legal definition of a tenement is a building that houses 3 or more families who all have their own kitchen. So it means it's a building that has 3 or more units in it, and each unit has its own kitchen. Now, if somebody were to describe that to me today, my first thought might not be tenement. My first thought probably is apartment. So tenements and apartments are the same. It's just different words have been used in different moments to describe that most specifically. Now, the turn of the 20th century, when the 1800s become the 1900s, the word tenement kind of gets a bad rap. There's some associations that get attached to it by people who think tenements are bad. And so those are people who start saying, well, tenements are crowded. Tenements are dirty. Tenements are places where English isn't spoken very often, where people are different than other Americans. And so that starts to be where we get this association between tenements and rundown living conditions or crowded living conditions. And one of the people who contributes to that is Jacob Reese. Jacob Reese took pictures that he compiled in a book called How the Other Half Lives, because he wanted people to think that tenements were negative. He thought they were bad. And so he took pictures of examples of poor living conditions and said, that's what it's like to live in a tenement. Those poor living conditions existed for some, but not because those people decided, oh, I think it's so fun to live in a small apartment with 8 people, but because the jobs or the opportunities they had available to them were limited. And so finding access to safe and decent shelter became difficult. And so this is a debate we still have to this day, right? Should people have access to safe and decent shelter? And what does that mean and look like? I would say that this apartment we're looking at now is safe and decent shelter. It was also rent controlled, which meant it wasn't as expensive as other apartments, which made it more accessible to a family like this one. That being said, this is not their first apartment in New York City. When they first moved here in 1955, they moved to a smaller apartment in the neighborhood. But by 1963, they're able to move into this bigger apartment, partially because Ramanita has saved up some money and gets good benefits from work, from being part of the union. Partially also because she's remarried. She has a husband and he works for Pan Am. And so his wages can also go towards paying for this apartment. And the boys are in high school and are helping out around the house too. This is not the exact unit the Saez-Valez family lived in. The pictures we see here is a recreation. There's work that we did to this apartment to say this is what it looked like when they lived here. But we were very, very lucky to be able to talk to members of the family. We have interviews from Ramanita herself. Ramanita isn't alive anymore, but when we were first becoming the Tenement Museum, we interviewed her. And her sons, Andy and Jose, they're still alive. In fact, Jose is coming to talk to us next week. And so they were able to tell us, this is what it looked like. This is what we remember. And the family was able to donate certain things to us. These cups on the stove, they have the Pan Am logo on them. They're really from this family. And there are other things around the apartment that is the case for as well. But when this family moves into the building, this is what the outside neighborhood looks like. So we can think back on Saez-Valez and then look at the Lower East Side of New York City, where we have so many more people. And I'd love to find out from you, I'll describe this image, but find out from you, what do you think was going through the minds of Ramanita or Andy or Jose when they first got here from Saez-Valez and this is what they saw? What do you think their thoughts and impressions were? I would say that on the sidewalk here, people are standing shoulder to shoulder. It looks like it's warm out. A lot of people are wearing short sleeves or dresses, but some people are still wearing suit jackets. There are so many storefront signs along these shops here: London character shoes, housewares, more shoes, Weissman's Delicatessen, and more that I can't read, but it looks like there's a movie theater over here. There's a bridge. Coming off the bridge, I see lots of cars and a telephone booth and more buildings and people trying to cross the street with cars crossing at the same time. So what do we think the Saez-Valezes were thinking when they first got here?
So people are noticing how much more crowded it is. It seems like another world. It's very different from the last photo. And we have also people thinking about lots of the advertisements, so thinking about the types of businesses, but we also have people thinking about Jacob Reese's legacy, and you know how even though sharing images of the squalor of tenement life gave tenements a bad reputation and colored people's impressions of the tenements in a certain way, Reese also provided resources to people to help with tuberculosis and other So we're having an interesting debate about the resources that were available to immigrants, perceptions of immigrants in the Lower East Side, and Jacob Reese's legacy, which is quite interesting. So I'm glad that we're having a critical historic discussion.
Great. I'm going to move us away from Jacob Reese because really that's a much earlier time period than we're looking at. But so long as we look at all history with a critical lens and we really think, why is this being shown to us? What is this trying to tell me? And what can I learn knowing all of that? So long as we're interrogating our primary sources, I think it's great. I think about how much more sound, how much louder it would be here. Also, I'm just noticing now the hot dog cart too. I'd missed that at first, and then the school bus back here. But yeah, it's very different. There's going to be more languages spoken here, more diversity of language, of religion, of ethnicity, all coming through here. And when this family first moves here, right, these kids are in elementary school. This is a picture of Jose's second grade class. This is Jose right here wearing a suit. And he was able to share his memories with us of living here, remembering that, right, Ramanita is working. She's working in that garment industry. She brings two boys with her who are in elementary school. The school day is not as long as the work day. So how is she balancing, and how are the boys also balancing sort of their different schedules and getting all of the things done that need to get done? And so I'm going to let Jose tell us about that.
My mother would work a lot, believe me, a lot. And before she left in the morning, my brother and I we had to keep a schedule. She will just get the beans, add the little water, that actually softens them up. So when we came from school, we switch on the burner very low, or my brother or I, either one. And when my mother comes from work, 4:30, the beans will be done. And clean the table. And if we burn the beans, we'll be in trouble, okay?
So everyone in this household is sharing responsibility. Everybody has their piece to do in order for the household to run smoothly. And so you can think about maybe the chores that you do or the responsibilities you have at home as well in thinking about how that's happening. Now I'm going to show you this other side of the kitchen here. I know we are thinking about things that really did belong to this family. This spice rack really was Ramanita's. It's the spice rack that she used. And so when Jose talks about, like, we cooked the beans, they weren't allowed to season them. That was Ramanita's job. So they would cook the beans during the day, but then Ramanita would come home and she would season them and get them ready for dinner. And so dinner was a family affair. Everybody had their piece, their responsibility here. By the time this family moves into this apartment, right, that's 1963. The boys are in high school. Jose is 14 years old when they first move in here, and they still have a lot of responsibilities that they're sharing to make sure that everything gets done here in this household. And one of the ways that happens is when they first move in, Jose convinces the landlord of the building to name him super of the building. And so that means that he is somebody who's going to help out around the building if things come up. If something breaks, he'll fix it or find somebody to fix it, find tenants to live in apartments and things like that. And he does that while attending school, while going to high school. This portrait here is the portrait of Andy and Jose when they graduate high school. They graduate high school in 1968, and Ramanita was really excited. So she had them go to Gus's on Rivington Street to have this portrait taken. She was really excited because, well, it was hard to graduate high school, particularly if you moved here not speaking English, because education was English only education. And that was a problem. It wasn't a new problem, though. English-only education had been around since the turn of the 20th century. One of the things progressive reformers like Jacob Reese were concerned with were these immigrants coming here and not becoming American enough. And everybody had their own idea of what that meant. There isn't one definition of being American. And so people said, well, we should only teach English in schools. And that was the case. There was, in 1903, there's a standardized curriculum that is created. And at this point, 70% of the public school students in New York City were immigrants or the children of immigrants who often didn't speak any English. And this continues to happen. This continues to happen all the way into the 1960s. And this Puerto Rican population starts to push back on that. They're able to say that we're US citizens. We deserve education that is tailored to us, education that we have access to. And eventually that happens. The Puerto Rican population is able to fight alongside a Black population in New York to try to desegregate schools and get services in the schools that are more geared to what they want and they need. And the Chinese population on the West Coast is also fighting for access to language education and sues the Supreme Court. And with all of these movements, we get to a place where we are today, where you have access to services in many different languages. Documents are sent home in many different languages. It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it once was. I think it would be easy for Andy and Jose to say, well, we did it. We graduated high school. We made it through. So other people should too. But that's not what they say. They say, this wasn't fair. This wasn't enough. And they both handle this in different ways. When we are talking about how we know what different pieces of the apartment looked like, we also have photographs of some sections of the apartment. And this is a picture of Ramanita on the same day as Andy's wedding. So that's why she looks so fancy. We can see a lot of similarities between this picture and the apartment, right? So we have these different ways of handling this. So thinking about language and how that's playing a role in the lives of these kids, Jose is going to tell us a little bit more about language and also media.
We had no cable, so you'd be watching local channels. Then after a couple of years, I think 60s or 70s, I think 2 Spanish channels came in that were transmitting from New Jersey. And so in order to get those channels, you had to go buy a little box. They said, buy the little box and you'll get channel 41 and 47, which were Spanish channels. And here, you're in New York, there's no Spanish channel. That was a big, great thing. Because your mother would want to watch the Spanish channels, you know, which was good because that kept you bilingual. You learn your English in school, in the streets, and your parents will talk to you in Spanish. And like today, you have a lot of kids in New York which don't speak Spanish. Okay.
So he's talking about how hard it is to hold on to a language. How hard it was to hold on to Spanish when there's so much English all around. So it's hard to learn English, but once you do, it's pervasive, it's everywhere. He says, you know, a lot of kids today, they don't speak Spanish. And we work with a sociologist a lot at the museum. His name is Phil Kasinitz. And he calls America the deathbed of languages, because by the 3rd generation, the likelihood that they speak the same language as their grandparents becomes pretty low. And so thinking about this balance of culture and what that looks like, and also the way this community is helping people access it, right? He said, they told you to get the little box and then you could access the Spanish channel. I always wonder who they is. Like, is it a neighbor? Is it somebody at the cable company? Is it, right? All of these different ways that you're learning this information. He said, and your mom wants Spanish. It was a way for her to hold on to her culture and her identity in that way. It made her feel more at home here, having access to that. I want to pause for a second. Are there questions that have come up, Lana?
Yeah, one I'm going to save for the end, but they're wondering what the community was like. Did the family experience any anti-migrant, anti-Puerto Rican, or anti-immigrant sentiments? That's the question.
Really glad you asked that. It's important to think about. I sort of paused to think about it because it's a little bit complicated. Because again, when we asked Ramanita like that question almost exactly in that way, she was like, no, it was great. Everything was fine. But then you start to listen to these stories, right, of school not being accessible in Spanish. That's an anti-migrant sentiment, right? There were also agencies set up, there were bureaus set up across New York City, so that if you were Puerto Rican, you could get this special ID that said you were Puerto Rican but a United States citizen. Because a lot of people who lived here didn't believe these Puerto Rican migrants were US citizens. They've been US citizens since the early 1900s. So for decades, right, by the time this family gets here, Puerto Ricans had been US citizens, but people didn't believe that for many cases. And so they would get these special IDs that no one else had to get. Like no other US citizens had to get these special IDs. And it was because they looked and sounded different than what people imagined the standard American, right? I put that in quotes because there is no one standard American. But what largely they mean by that is a white person who speaks English without an accent. Ramanita said that she never got one of those. It wasn't something she felt like she needed, but a lot of other people did. They felt like they needed access to that. So that shows us that there was a lot of discrimination that these groups were facing. But again, how people tell you their own stories, we also need to balance their perspectives too. Another way this is coming up as well is when the boys graduate high school. They graduate high school in 1968. This is during the Vietnam conflict. And a lot of Puerto Ricans are drafted and fight in this conflict. And they were treated differently in the armed forces based on their race or how they were perceived. That isn't a story that Andy tells us specifically, but it's a story that we have from a lot of Puerto Rican service members. But I want to let Andy tell us a little bit more about that. He eventually marries a woman named Jenny. They were high school sweethearts, and this is them more recently talking about their experience of this.
That was during June, my last month in school. At that time was the Vietnam War, so all the males that were registered, a lot of them got drafted, and they sent me a letter with the token to make sure I'd be there on that date. I went up in the Air Force. Everybody was being shipped to Vietnam.
I mean, I was heartbroken. His brother Jose was very, very emotional. You know, we were all frightened for him at that time. I remember that day. And we waved goodbye to him, mostly calls, because it was long distance, but it wasn't like when he was in Vietnam that we did tapes, little cassette tapes. We used to send each other. We got married like 6 months later, after you started basic. I don't even remember. It was just like, you just knew.
I'm coming in, we're gonna get married, I guess.
You said, well, you know what? I think we're gonna get married. When I come, we're gonna have to do it in a rush, because our wedding was like an overnight thing. And I just went and I bought my dress, and then when he came on leave, that weekend we got married.
So they got married at St. Teresa's Church, which is just a few blocks away. And Jose, Andy's brother, got them a limo for their wedding day. That was his gift to them. And while Andy is in Vietnam, Jenny comes and lives here with Ramanita. At this time, Jose has moved into the super's apartment. He's going to Puerto Rico a lot. He meets a woman named Migdalia, and they eventually get married. And they become really involved in a program. So this is Jose and this is Migdalia. And this is a school building that becomes a place called Solidaridad Humana, which means human solidarity in Spanish. And this is a way that the Puerto Rican community was saying, there's a lot of services that we aren't getting, that we're being overlooked for or lacking. And so if the city or the state isn't going to help provide that, or the schools aren't going to help provide that, we're going to do it ourselves. So this Puerto Rican population takes over this abandoned school, and they set up this organization called Solidaridad Humana, where they have English classes, where they have help to write a resume, where they have help with job interviews, and all of these things to help create a solid and supportive community where people are able to help one another out. And Migdalia signed up first as a student and then becomes a teacher there. One of the things that the organization believes in was that everybody had something to learn and everybody had something to teach. So everybody was both a student and a teacher. And Jose also acted as super of the building. So he made sure that things were repaired and cleaned and all of those kinds of things.
So Danielle, we actually have a question about the size of this apartment, and this is kind of a hard question. So the person wants to know, is the size of this apartment average for the time period? And then is this also average for the average American apartment or home today? Big question.
I don't know if I can, I mean, on like average American home, it's probably smaller because that includes a lot of like houses. But in New York City, like this apartment here, let's go back to.
I would say it's bigger than my apartment. So
It's bigger than my apartment.
Yeah.
And it's bigger than the majority of the apartments on the Lower East Side. This apartment was seen as large. When this family moved in, they moved in from a 1-bedroom apartment to a 2-bedroom apartment, right? And they have also a living room and a dining room. It's really big for families in the neighborhood then and now. Yeah. Anything else?
not about the Saez-Valez family. I'm going to save it for when we speak at the end.
Okay. Oh, this is the picture that I forgot to show you before. So this is St. Teresa's church. So this is where they got married. And this family is a Catholic family. So we can see also, you know, they have their family Bible, a plate of the Pope, right? So thinking about their religion. I also love that we see this camera here because Jose also liked to take a lot of pictures. So a lot of the ways in which we know the apartment looked like were pictures that he himself took with a camera, a lot like this one. It's not the button I meant to press. Okay. And 1 second. There we go. So eventually, let's go back here for just a second. So eventually, Jose and Migdalia, they live in the building, still in the super's apartment, but Migdalia decides she wants to raise a family in Puerto Rico. That's where she wants to raise kids. So she and Jose move back to Puerto Rico to do that. Andy comes back from Vietnam and Andy needs a job, so he becomes super of this building. And then eventually he and Jenny move into another home elsewhere, but Ramanita lives in this building until 2011. And so this is Migdalia and Ramanita's granddaughters with Ramanita in that very same apartment, you know. And so the family keeps coming back here. Ramanita lives here until 2011. In 2011, she needed some more care. So she moved back to Puerto Rico to live there with Jose and Migdalia. And she dies there in 2013. Apparently she was dancing up until the day before she died, though. But we asked what they wanted people to know about Ramanita.
¿Cómo la describo? Pues yo la describo como, yo se lo hablo a ella, que era una mujer muy luchadora. Ella no fue de las personas que vino aquí a recostarse, de que le dieran. Ella fue una mujer que vino a luchar, que estuvo toda su vida trabajando, dándole duro al trabajo, siempre estuvo luchando. Por eso es que tal vez José también, porque la veía a ella en ese espíritu de lucha. Y yo le hablo a mis nietas, le digo sobre eso, que hay que imitar al que es bueno, al que lucha, porque la vida es lucha.
And so, you know, she wants everybody to remember that Ramanita fought hard and she fought for her family. Looking around here, I just want to point out just some other things about the family that we can learn just from looking around, right? We learned about their religion, Jose's hobby of photography. There's also lots of plants. Ramanita really liked having living plants in her home. That was a hobby of hers. And we can also see all of these doilies that she crocheted herself. So thinking about the ways in which she was, you know, making this a home. I think we can open this up to some questions from the group that maybe are a little bit more broad than they have been. So any questions you have, make sure to send them in to us and Lana will pass them to me.
Great. And Danielle, thank you. And I think this is actually a really good slide to have open for this question because they're wondering, is the museum all about this time period of the 1960s? And if it's not, which spoiler alert, it's not, what other apartments are there and what types of stories did they tell?
Okay. So the Tenement Museum, we have two buildings. We have 103 Orchard Street, which is where we are looking at today, where we tell these more recent histories, where we'd look at the 1950s into the 1980s. But we also have 97 Orchard Street, which is just down the block. So we can see them here. They're just separated by two other buildings. And this building was built in 1863, and we tell stories in that building from 1863 until 1935. So a sampling of some of the stories we tell, and we always tell the stories of real families. So we're always looking at real people. So we have a German lager beer saloon. We have an apartment from a 14-year-old Sephardic girl from 1916. We have the Gumpert's family, a German Jewish family living in the building in the 1870s. Valdesi's, an Italian Catholic family living in the building in the 1930s. The Levines, an Eastern European Jewish family living in the building in the 1890s. And then we have the Rogarshevsky family, an Eastern European Jewish family living in the building in the 19-teens. The Moore family, an Irish family living in the building in 1869. And so you might have noticed that all of those families that I just talked about are white. A lot of white people lived in that building. So in this other building where we talked about the Saez-Valez family, we also talk about another family, the Wang family in the 1980s. They're a Chinese family. And we are also developing a program that will also be in 97 Orchard Street, looking at another family also called the Moores, but they are a Black family that will be telling their story hopefully very soon, but it's ongoing. We have research happening there to try to make sure that when we're looking at families who live in tenement or apartment buildings, who are involved in, you know, creating stories of what it means to be an American, right? They're regular people, but they're part of this identity creation process that we have, that we're working on making sure that those voices are as diverse as they can be.
And Danielle, people are wondering, how did the museum get started?
We got started with two women, Ruth Abram and Anita Jacobson. They decided they wanted to tell the stories of working class immigrants in a public setting because they felt like that was a history that was undertold and people didn't have a lot of access to. And so they found a way to make that happen. And so they got started, they got started in this building. This is what I've been calling the Flagship Building, 97 Orchard Street, 103, where we were today. This has been part of the Tenement Museum for about the last 10-ish years.
Great. And what's really interesting, I think I'm going to transition a little bit. So we're going to talk more about who we are and our roles in the museum.
Okay, I'm going to stop sharing this then.
Oh, okay. Sure, no problem. So what's wonderful is that the museum itself is like a time capsule. So when Ruth Abrams and Anita Jacobson discovered the museum in 1988, had been closed since the 1930s, and they opened the front door to the hallway, and it was as if they were transported 50 years back into time. So the museum has a very interesting history just in how museums are developed. It's very different from other historic house museums that may have started with people who were rich or famous or in positions of power, and had their possessions preserved. And so it's a bottom up, if you will, as opposed to top down level of museum work. And so I'm the collections manager at the museum. So I'm like a librarian, but for the objects, I make sure that everything is preserved. I also do things like pest management, historic housekeeping, and then work with the curatorial team, of which I'm on, to help reframe the objects so that they tell the stories in the best light. And Danielle, if you'd like to tell about your story, Danielle is the storyteller. She's one of the storytellers at the museum.
Yeah, so I'm in the education department. My title is technically lead educator. I got started at the museum part-time as an educator, telling the stories, and now I'm full-time, and help research and write and make sure that we are taking, scholarship and translating it in a way that is accessible to many different age groups, many different people coming from different perspectives. And I totally lost my train.
One thing that's really interesting is that our founders were not historians in the traditional academic sense. And while they had studied history, they took on this idea that history should have a public role, that history can be told in different ways. And so our roles are also telling history through these interactive ways where you visit the apartment, whether virtually or in person, and you get to learn about real people through their objects and their voices. And we're just facilitators to help channel those voices. So our staff also has a diverse background in where they come from to tell these stories. So if you're students who are interested in studying history and continuing history, these are some places that you may think about exploring or learning more about as far as career roles. I myself have a background in cultural anthropology and studio art. So it's not necessarily the history background, but it's learning about people in a different perspective in a different way. Many people also on our staff have different backgrounds, whether it be immigration studies or human rights or sociology. So Danielle, what was your background?
I have a very classic history background. I have an undergraduate degree in American history and a master's degree in American studies with a concentration in American history. And I came to the Tenement Museum because I went to a talk that was about like working outside of academia, and everybody at the talk talked about the Tenement Museum, except for none of them worked at the Tenement Museum. And then I found my way at the Tenement Museum and was like, yeah, I need to work here. And I've been at the museum now 8 years.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Danielle knows so much. The history of the museum has changed even in those 8 years. The apartment that we visited today, I believe, was in the development stages, actually, when you joined the museum. So it's interesting how the museum itself has changed over time. I worked for the National Park Service, actually, before coming to the museum. So that is even an interesting career field because you have both the cultural resources and the natural resources that you're addressing. And I went from a very traditional historic house museum of a United States president, which had velvet ropes across the door, and everything was preserved like a time capsule. And I was really drawn to the Tenement Museum because it is so interactive and these stories are told in a way that no other museum is telling these stories. The exhibits are always changing, and people have a hand in helping us change and develop those exhibits by asking questions. Yeah. What else do we have to add? Katie.
Thank you both so much. I just wanted to share a couple other comments coming in. People who have visited the museum years ago loved it. And someone saying, this is one of my favorite museums on the planet. So
Thank you.
fans. And looking forward to visiting it as well. And Lana and Danielle, thank you so much for being with us today. We truly appreciate you sharing this story and teaching us a bit more about this in your museum.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. And if anyone who's watching is interested in visiting any of the other apartments that Danielle expertly told floor by floor, I was so impressed by that. You can visit our website to learn more about our virtual field trips.
Yes, and I
we have
shared that
virtual
link
tours
in the chat.
Wonderful. All right.
Well, have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Or rest of your night, wherever you may be joining us from.
Yes, thank you all for joining us, and be sure to tune back in on Tuesday next week at 4 p.m. as we virtually visit with Chamizal National Memorial, and have a wonderful day.